Hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning to you, whether you're on the East Coast, the West Coast, or somewhere in the middle. We're really happy that you could join us for this Healthy Watersheds Consortium webinar presented by the Puget Sound Regional Council and the Emerald Alliance. For anyone who may not be familiar with the Healthy Watersheds Consortium, it is a partnership between the EPA, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. We're all working together as equal funding partners to accelerate the protection of watersheds that are still in relatively good condition before they require extensive and expensive restoration. We provide competitive grants to help build capacity and catalyze the protection of thousands of acres of watershed land through projects involving land conservation, stewardship, policy, finance, as well as engaging communities and water providers. I want to give special thanks to our federal partners, to the EPA's Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds for their leadership in conceiving the program and providing resources to get it started, and to the Natural Resource Conservation Service within the U.S. Department of Agriculture for joining us and being a partner for the last 3 years. We appreciate their support, their guidance, and their recommendations, and they've been really great partners over the past several years. And speaking of partners, I now get to introduce to you not one but two of our Healthy Watersheds grantees and the three speakers on today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce to you, in the order that they'll be speaking, Erica Harris, who is a senior planner with the Puget Sound Regional Council and was a lead for the planning effort that you'll be hearing about. Maria Sandercock is currently a shoreline planner with the Washington Department of Ecology, but previously worked with the PSRC team on this project. Tracy Stanton is the Executive Director of the Emerald Alliance. The Alliance is a new voice for advancing collaborative land conservation efforts in the Puget Sound region that will provide multiple benefits, such as watershed protection, to the growing communities there. For a little bit of background, the Puget Sound Regional Council received the Healthy Watersheds Consortium grant in 2016. Many of our Healthy Watersheds projects are tied to the implementation of watershed plans, and as many of you know, there are hundreds or even thousands of such plans, and they are often created outside of the local land use decision-making process. And so what PSRC proposed was to build a regional open space conservation strategy and to incorporate watershed protection goals into that plan. And we thought that this was a particularly clever idea and an excellent way to raise the profile of watershed protection and get possibly 86 jurisdictions all rowing in the same direction toward its implementation. That open space plan is now done, and you're going to hear about it, but there's still much to do, and so the second grant we made in 2018 to the Emerald Alliance focuses on the funding or finance mechanisms that will be needed to implement the open space plan and coordinate among the various stakeholders as well as PSRC. And although the work of the Emerald Alliance is still in process, we thought it would be of interest to this audience to hear about both of these projects together because they're so tightly connected. And we also have a request for you in the audience. As you're listening to Tracy's presentation, please be thinking about finance mechanisms for watershed protection that you know about or are exploring currently. At the end of the presentation, if you've got something in mind that you didn't hear discussed, we'll ask you to submit it in the chat box to capture some of these possible mechanisms for further exploration. I just want to thank you all again for attending the webinar. The Healthy Watersheds Consortium really likes these large visions with ambitious protection goals. I think you'll be impressed by this work undertaken in the Puget Sound region's watershed and all the coordination that's gone on among so many different jurisdictions. We hope this webinar may inspire those of you working in other states on watershed protection, especially if you're thinking about coordinating regionally among your local government. We look forward to your questions and discussion after the presentation. So welcome again, Erica, and the microphone is now yours.
Thank you, and greetings from Seattle to everyone. We're excited to tell you about our open space planning here in the central Puget Sound region. First, I'll tell you a little bit about the Puget Sound Regional Council and a little bit of background of the project. Maria will tell you more about the plan and how it was developed. And then Tracy with the Emerald Alliance will tell you about her work. The central Puget Sound region is 4 counties: Snohomish, King, Pierce and Kitsap counties, and there are 82 cities and towns within those counties. There are over 4 million people at this point, and that's within 8 watersheds that we're looking at. They all drain to the Puget Sound, so that's why we're so interested in this work, because we know that we have a lot of work to do to make Puget Sound healthy for everyone, including our orcas and salmon. So the Puget Sound region is a total of 6,400 square miles, with 1,000 of them being urban areas. An important thing to note is Washington State has a Growth Management Act, so we've designated urban growth areas, and so we are working under that framework. And the Central Puget Sound region has even more specific frameworks with our regional planning, which I'll tell you more about. We like to say that PSRC is where the region comes together to make decisions, and we have an integrated plan to guide that. It's currently Vision 2040, and that's our plan for growth management, economic development, environment, and transportation, and it focuses on sustainability, that triple bottom line of people, prosperity, and planet. So it has a focus on healthy people, environment, and economy, and really trying to have a focus also on protecting open space, including farms and forests and water. As I mentioned, our growth is focused in urban growth areas, but more specifically in cities, and within those cities in centers. We have a regional growth centers framework, and so the idea for that is creating vibrant, healthy, walkable communities that are connected by high-capacity transit. And we really feel that planning for where growth should occur is just as important as where growth shouldn't occur. We really appreciate our beautiful farms and forests that we have all around us, and of course we want to keep them there. So we also have multi-county planning policies within Vision 2040, and those extend to all of the cities as they do their comprehensive planning and pull those multi-county planning policies within their plans. We also have actions in Vision, and that's important because that's kind of the start of this project, which had a bit of a road. But before that, I wanted to talk to you about what we expect in the future and why this planning is so important. For Vision 2040, we were already expecting a lot of growth, but we know now in planning for 2050 that we expect even more population and employment growth. So out to 2050, we're expecting 1.8 million more people, so a total of 5.8 million people, and 3.4 million jobs. So hard work is still cut out for us for growth planning. So that will tell you a little bit more about Vision 2050 later, which is our current plan that we're working on now. But back to Vision 2040, which was adopted in 2008. Within that plan, there was an action that talked about developing a regional green space strategy. At the time, we didn't quite have the capacity to work on that, but a group headed by the University of Washington called the Regional Open Space Strategy started to develop and really provided the foundation for that we're doing now at PSRC. And the ROS, or the Regional Open Space Strategy, was a great foundation for our work. It really kind of defined open space, what are we talking about, and Maria will get into that more later. But also, it really explained why it's so important. And you see this table here showing the contribution of nature to the economy, and that's a study done by Earth Economics. And they valued open space services, which are pretty much the same as ecosystem services, between 11.4 or 5 and 25.3 billion dollars a year. So quite a lot that we get from our open space in the region, and you can see the variety of services they provide, anything from water, clean water to clean air to different materials for building. So very crucial, and our boards really appreciated this work, and that's one reason we wanted to keep going with our open space plan. So a couple of recommendations I wanted to focus on from that earlier work. The first one was to create a dynamic regional vision, and that's kind of what we're diving into with our regional open space conservation plan. And then later Tracy will talk to you about convening a collaborative alliance at the end. The regional open space strategy final report is that link at the very bottom, and you can also just look around their website. There's a lot of great material there. And you can also get to it from PSRC's open space website. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the process that we worked with our stakeholders, because we do have a lot of stakeholders in the region. It was the grant from the U.S. Endowment that really made it possible to do this work. Probably one of the foundational pieces was actually the letters of support that we got from the executives of each of the 4 counties who it was clear even before that we applied for the grant that they were very supportive and would be very helpful in this work. So they were key. So we have all 4 counties working with us. And of course, we want to work with cities and towns in the region. We connected with all of the tribes in the region. And you can see these other stakeholders. And they also represent plans. A lot of these groups have plans. And so we tried to look through their plans and weave their plans together to have one integrated plan that covered our open space priorities in the region. So we did talk to all these folks either on the phone or had meetings. With the counties, we had many meetings with a multidisciplinary group at each step of the way. And then another key way that we engaged with stakeholders and got a lot of guidance was through our advisory committee. And that was about 16 folks who made up a variety of stakeholders. We tried to get a broad representation and also geographically, so looking at different parts of the region to make sure we had good representation. So, and one of our tribal leaders was the chair for that advisory committee. So I think with that, I will hand it over to Maria to talk more about the plan.
Okay, so this map that you're looking at shows kind of a close-up of our region, and it shows the 8 major watersheds that overlap our region, and this constituted our study area for the plan. This includes the gray area in the middle, shows you where our designated urban growth area is. You can also see a lot of the higher elevation parts of our watersheds are actually in federal and state lands, and then we have rural lands sort of in between that, and sort of the backbone along the middle is the Puget Sound. And so, as Erica kind of alluded to, a big component of this plan was developing that dynamic regional vision, which we decided to call our Regional Open Space Network. And this, to do that, we first identified 6 categories of open space, which are shown here. So these include aquatic system or lands that support aquatic systems. So these are floodplains, salmon and forage fish habitat, marine corridors, and areas that support drinking water. We also have farmland as a category. We have working forests as a category, natural lands, and that includes lands that support biodiversity in the region and ecosystem processes and our wilderness areas, and also one national park. We also have regional trails and then urban open space. And that was a category we added a little bit later. The urban open space represents our system of parks and urban designated open space areas that the region's residents in our urban growth area can access easily. Our advisory committee found that this is important to include because having that nearby access to nature is important for the quality of life for our residents, as well as making our urban growth areas attractive to live in and relieving some of the development pressure on our more rural areas. So to actually start mapping out where these open spaces are, as Erica mentioned, we worked with our advisory committee as well as a lot of the different conservation groups in the region, including the 4 counties, a number of cities, resource agencies, tribal agencies. There's a lot of existing plans out there. There's some watershed plans that we're able to draw from. So gathering GIS data, looking at how other groups have prioritized open space. And so we were able to map out where is the open space in our region. And then our advisory committee helped us identify criteria for what are the regionally important open spaces that we want to include in our regional open space network. So this map on the left shows what we were able to map for our regional open space network, and the bubbles on the right give you a sense of how many acres are included in this network, and you can see there's actually a good amount of overlap among the different categories of open space. A lot of our open space lands support multiple different types of open space services. For example, a lot of our farmlands are in our river valleys, which also have floodplains, important salmon habitat, wildlife habitat. So a lot of our open spaces are playing double and triple duty. And again, this network, this map, it's a collection of both public and private lands that are the most essential for supporting the quality of life that we have in our region, as well as supporting the health of our watersheds and supporting biodiversity and the ecosystem processes we have. So then after we map this out, our next step was to think, okay, well, what do we have, what's our remaining work to do to ensure that we have this network for future generations to enjoy? So we wanted to identify what are the conservation needs that we need to focus our efforts on. And so it was a sort of two-step process. The graphic on the right is a high-level overview of the process. The first step was to identify the parts of the network that are not already in long-term protection. And to define long-term protection, we considered lands that are owned outright or that are in a conservation easement by a public agency, a tribal agency, or a conservation nonprofit to be in long-term protection. So we focused on the lands not in that protection, and then further filtered those down depending on the type of open space it is. So for farmland, we found that lands that still have development capacity and that aren't in long-term protection are going to be the conservation needs for farmland. For working forests, it's a little bit narrower. So again, lands that still have development capacity and that are not designated for forestry, or that are designated for forestry, but the parcel sizes are smaller than 20 acres. For our aquatic and natural land conservation needs, we focused on areas that are relatively undeveloped, as identified by the National Land Cover Dataset. And for trails, those are the trails that would complete existing trails, connect trails, and some of the planned trails that our counties have for a complete regional trail system. And then, so the map on the left shows you where in our region we can find our remaining conservation needs. And then we were able to quantify an estimate of the acres that this represents, so about 463,000 acres in our region across 8 watersheds. And we were able to quantify this for each of our watersheds, so we make sure that each watershed is getting the conservation that it needs to be fully healthy. And you'll notice that urban open space is not on here because we identified those conservation needs through a slightly different process that I'm going to highlight quickly. So as I mentioned, we were able to map out our all the parks and designated open spaces, green spaces in our urban areas. And then we were able to use that map of that system to identify locations that do and do not have access, like with people who live within walking distance of those parks. And so we were able to find our gap areas, the areas that don't have that easy access. And then we prioritized those gap areas by using the level of canopy cover in them, as well as an index of demographics, which included income level, race, and English language proficiency. So we prioritize these. Our highest priority would be those gap areas that have low canopy cover and have high numbers of people with low income, from a minority group, or have or immigrant community. And so those are the red areas on the map that you can see to the right, and they represent about 24 distinct areas in the region that we wanted to elevate as our highest priority gap areas. About at least 24 parks just to address the neediest current gap areas. We also wanted to think a little bit about how the region's going to be growing in the future to make sure future growth is accommodated as well. So we overlaid our regional growth centers on our gap areas and found an additional 4 existing gap areas that we wanted to elevate as priorities because we know we're going to direct a lot of growth in the future to those areas. And a similar process with our high-capacity transit stations or transit communities that when we overlaid that, we found an additional 19 gap areas that we wanted to elevate as priorities for future park investments. So having identified these conservation needs, we then wanted to think about what is our action plan for addressing these needs and ensuring that our open space network remains in the future. So our first action is, as this is our action plan, we have 10 actions. Number 1 is to incorporate open space conservation into all levels of planning. As Erica alluded to, we're updating Vision 2040 to Vision 2050, so this is a great opportunity to integrate this map and these concepts into our regional planning. And then we also hope that our local jurisdictions, counties, and cities also incorporate this into their planning decisions at the local level. Number 2, support growth in the right places. So we have 1.8 million more people coming to the region by 2050. So ensuring that those people are going to places that can accommodate that growth will help relieve development pressure on our rural areas, our open space areas. Number 3, keep working lands working. And this includes supporting the farming economies, forestry economies, improving our regional transfer of development rights program, which helps uses growth to fund conservation easements on farms and forests. Number 4, protect remaining key habitat areas as identified in the plan. Number 5, support urban open space and increase access to nearby nature for urban residents. Number 6, build out the regional trail network. 7, enhance stewardship on open space lands, and this is both public and private. In the region, we have conservation districts as well as the Washington State University Extension Program that both work with private landowners providing educational programs and seminars, technical assistance to develop stewardship plans, as well as some grant money to fund best management practices that can help improve that stewardship on private lands. We also have some of our conservation groups work with cities and counties on public land stewardship programs, including urban forestry, for example. Number 8, restore habitat in high-value areas. So we know that even if we are able to conserve or preserve the remaining lands in our open space network, we still are going to need to go a little bit further to recover the health of our salmon populations and the health of Puget Sound, and that includes restoring some key remaining areas in our watersheds. Number 9, coordinate planning among and within agencies and jurisdictions. So within a city, making sure the departments are talking to each other so that their work is not precluding the work of another one, that they're relatively aligned in their missions. And then between cities, particularly cities that are in the same watershed, making sure that they're talking to each other so that they can better prioritize how their development works within that watershed. And then number 10, building multi-benefit green infrastructure. So as land and space becomes more at a premium, looking at how we can provide multiple services within the same land, and a stormwater park would probably be a great example, an area where you can, the stormwater utility can address stormwater needs, and then the park district can also create a park at that location and address that need in the same location. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Erica.
I'll tell you a little bit about next steps and incorporating all of this work into our regional plan. As I mentioned, we wanted to make sure that our boards and committees were up to speed on this throughout the process, so a lot of presentations, and received a lot of support from all of our boards and committees. And what they told us is they didn't want this plan to just sit on the shelf, that it was really important to implement it. So we are continuing to share this plan with folks in the region, our jurisdictions, our nonprofits, different stakeholders, and we can share the data as needed. Continue to work with partners on identified actions in the plan. One example is the work that we're doing with green infrastructure. We're working with our State Department of Commerce and how to best incentivize green stormwater infrastructure in development projects. We also are looking to advance key conservation tools. We have an open space assessment tool that's also on our website. And that's been helpful for some folks who don't have GIS, and they can zoom in and understand some of the open space in our region. I'll talk in a minute about incorporating this into Vision 2050. And then the next step will be to monitor the progress and update this plan. This is the first time we've done a plan like this in the region, and we want to make sure we understand how it's progressing. And we know from partners that they are continuing to do great work with conserving open space, building out the regional trail network, building new parks, and renovating existing parks. So we're seeing some progress, but we want to be able to systematically monitor it and see how we're doing. So again, we heard lots of support for this plan from our boards and committees, and they wanted to incorporate some of the key pieces into Vision 2050, our next integrated regional plan. In general, protecting and restoring open space is important. And again, open space is really kind of a catch-all for lots of different important green spaces like forests and farms and floodplains. So that's an important overarching goal. Also, improving water quality. I mentioned Puget Sound Health, and that's a key focus for a lot of the jurisdictions and stakeholders in the region. We really want to do our best to help our orcas and our salmon, but also make sure that we have good drinking water and good access to the floodplains and the water and protect them. Also, increasing equitable access to parks, trails, and open space is a priority for folks in the region. And then we also wanted to highlight the importance of open space in climate change mitigation and the sequestration of not only our forests, but our wetlands and farms, soils, lots of different ways that open space can help our environmental quality. And so we wanted to make sure that that also gets reflected in our plan. So not only do we have these and other policies that support the open space plan, but we also have actions. And that is one way that this grant has really helped to add capacity, because through putting these actions into our plan, that's putting that work into our future work programs and putting staff to work on these projects. So I think we'll see a lot of future work on this. So I wanted to now turn this over to Tracy, and she'll tell you some about the Emerald Alliance and how they're helping to conserve open space in the region.
We're just moving seats here in the room. Thank you very much, Erica. It's great to have an opportunity in advance of being completed with this work to tell a little bit about how we're going about carrying this regional open space plan into action, and how do we pay for all of that. So we're grateful to have funding from the U.S. Endowment to build that capacity as we go forward. My role is to tell you a little bit about the work of the Emerald Alliance and the way in which we're using the funding from the endowment to implement this regional open space plan. But before I can do that, I would like to just step back and give a little context for the work of the Emerald Alliance. And Erica alluded to kind of our origins in that regional open space strategy, that ROS effort. So I just want to give you a little context for going about our work, which then leads to the funding piece and the implementation piece. So what I love about this photo taken from an airplane window flying out of Seattle last October is that it reflects the iconic landscapes that we all love in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm a transplant from the Midwest and the East Coast, and can't imagine a more beautiful place in which to do this work. And it really is what inspires a lot of activity, both in planning and in conservation. And the work of the Alliance is predicated on the idea that We want to connect the work of planning and growth management to the work of conservation and restoration, and that's not always been the way the work has happened out here. Parallel tracks, and so our focus is to try to bring those efforts together to show really how an effort in a conservation investment really is a catalyst for achieving many other benefits. And so foundationally, thinking about our landscape as the first place we want to protect, because it enables us to build resiliency against the impacts of climate change and many other of the goals of decision makers across the region. Spurred in the work of the Emerald Alliance and in this conservation plan, as Erica talked about, with the declining health of Puget Sound and what that means, again, iconically for our orca and for the food web that supports that, all of that begins up in the watersheds. And so healthier watersheds leads to the health of Puget Sound. And then that growth pressure that Erica talked about. So seeing all of that connected on this landscape, but then relating it to how people interact with that landscape and what benefits flow from the landscape that people, that directly accrue to people. So this is the way that we look at our mandate in the central Puget Sound region, is that connecting the upper watersheds to the health of Puget Sound. And so again, Erica talked about principles of sustainability, and so we really continually talk about the connectivity of the landscape, the health of that landscape, and really it's at the heart of our vision in the Emerald Alliance, and that a healthy landscape really is at the heart of how livability, resiliency, economic prosperity happens. Without the health of that landscape, then all these other goals in terms of healthy people, healthy planet, and healthy economy are going to be really, really difficult to achieve, especially as we grow into the future. So Erica again talked about that making the business case for that multiple benefit. Any one investment in a conservation action or a restoration action really yields these multiple benefits, and so we continue to talk about that at the heart of our work in the Emerald Alliance. When that research project, the Ross, was wrapping up, and the one recommendation that called out the need for a regional collaborative, the Emerald Alliance stepped into that space to fill that gap. While Puget Sound Regional Council and the work that Erica leads here on the growth management side is focused on the growth management, it's not always been focused on the conservation sector and how those efforts really go hand in hand. And so the Alliance is stepping into that space. We imagine ourselves functioning as a very small backbone organization, like through a collective impact approach, and providing a neutral platform, which doesn't really exist across the conservation community, to bring the community together, to share information, to create new resources and tools that support this work at a regional scale. We can reduce fragmentation across the sector. We can also reduce it across funding. And ultimately, the effort is built around this more powerful movement working toward building new resources into the work of conservation and restoration. And so we're leading with these four things. This is where the conservation community came together and asked the Alliance to focus its efforts. That capacity around diversifying the conservation sector and the way that we do our work, and building in more equity and inclusion into the groups that we engage and how we engage at that very local level, and lowering the barriers for other conservation organizations to make progress in their diversifying their own workplaces and the way they do their work. Bringing in the business sector as a partner. It's been a challenge for the conservation sector here. And how can we lead in that space? How can we open those doors and invite invite business sector in as a key partner in sharing both of their capacities in technology and business sector processing innovation, but also in tapping into the funding and their interest in protecting what they benefit from in healthy conservation activity and healthy landscapes, and that's workforce. People move out here because it's a beautiful place to live and work, and the business sector benefits from the fact that we have a healthy, beautiful, treasured landscape, and we'd like to engage them in helping to protect it. Part of that involves how do we talk about this work of conservation fundamental to the health of our economy and people in a way that resonates with these new audiences, such as the business sector. And so we're working to create some of the narratives, some of the data that this plan uncovered and pulled together. How do we translate that into the messages that resonate with businesses and other sectors that we'd like to involve in this work? And then fundamentally streamlining how we invest in this. How do we pay for it? How do we understand the total cost of investing in this, where the gaps are, and how do we fill those gaps? So this is a slide that you've seen already earlier in the presentation, but I come back to it now because this is the vision for what it is we need to prioritize, and therefore the work of the Alliance going forward. This is our sort of framing for what it is we're trying to create funding to support. This is an incredibly large lift in terms of acres, but this is exactly the kind of prioritized vision that we need in order to know how we're meeting our conservation objectives, where we need to prioritize our funding, and how do we do that. This is at the watershed scale, and we're working with Erica and the team here at PSRC now to translate this into the county scale. Our system of governance out here is driven a lot by funding at the county level, and so we need to also understand how this translates so that we can track that funding at the county level. So speaking of one of those county efforts, PSRC's jurisdiction are these 4 central Puget Sound counties. One of them is King County. It's often, it's both loved and hated because it's where the population center is. This is where Seattle sits, and it has an incredibly talented workforce, and it usually garners a lot of resources. And one of the projects they recently undertook was at the same time that PSRC was creating this regional open space plan, King County was working on their own open space plan per se. It was called the Land Conservation Initiative, and it sought to identify the last remaining high-value conservation lands across the county and how they would go about protecting those, and working very aggressively to front-load investments so that as the explosive growth that we expect to continue, how could the county front-load the funding necessary to acquire and or protect that land in some way? And so what the Alliance, what I get to benefit from is that they had a methodology that started with a designated acres that they were seeking to protect, and then doing an inventory of the mechanisms that are already available to fund that work. And so as you look at this pie chart, the top right-hand quadrant are the current funding mechanisms that fund this work in conservation and preservation in most of the counties, but this is specific to King County. And then as you go around the pie chart, you get into that area in the upper left-hand quadrant, which is the designated new funding sources needed in order to protect their last remaining acres, high-value conservation acres. 66,000 acres they identified at a cost of $1.65 billion. And so imagine that the Emerald Alliance, with funding from the U.S. Endowment, we now have 450,000 acres, roughly, regional trail connections and urban infrastructure to invest in. Our job is to take this model and figure out how to do this exercise for all 4 counties so that we can move into the space of how do we fill the funding gap? How do we front load across the whole region the connectivity and protection of this open space network? And then how do we drive the new funding into it? And continue the terrific coordination work that was started through the open space conservation planning work here at PSRC, and connecting this work really thoughtfully at the county as well as the municipal level. So I want to talk just a little bit about some of the innovative funding projects that we're thinking of, that we're hearing about in our region, we've heard about in other regions, and that is we imagine at the end of our inventory work and trying to think about how we fill the gap, what are those options? What are people experimenting with, and where can we imagine scaling up this work with new sources of funding? So I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that PCC Farmland Trust has done around creating an impact note, basically pulling together a group of investors and creating their own private impact fund, and using that to purchase really iconic farmland up in the Snohomish Valley, with habitat along the Skykomish River, with forested landscapes, with really rich ag soils that we want to make sure are protected in perpetuity. And so they set about creating this impact note to purchase an overall, I think it was 260 acres at a total cost of about $3.8 million. And they're using this impact approach to raise $2.8 million. And so we're keeping a close eye on this. The rest of the ag conservation community is keeping a close eye on this for how this mechanism, this funding mechanism, might be scaled up to bring new dollars into purchasing conservation easements and or purchasing land in our ag sector, which is, I don't know if Erica mentioned this or Maria, the ag lands are some of the most at risk, and those are the ones that there's a lot of emphasis on ag sector protection, both for the functionality of our ag sector and robust food system support, but also water quality and the connectivity to the forest health upstream. One of the things we're also looking at is innovating within current funding mechanisms that could be used for conservation that we don't typically think of. And I have FEMA mitigation dollars mentioned here. FEMA is interested in connecting regional trails and funding those trail connections. Most of you probably know we live in the land of the potential for a very large earthquake and what that might mean for the disruption of mobility in the region, crossing bridges or moving up and down I-5. FEMA sees our regional trail system as an escape route in the event of that big catastrophic, some kind of big catastrophic disturbance to our transportation network. And so we're looking at how do we tap those dollars, those mitigation dollars, to build these important trail connections that we also, of course, we think of them as escape routes, but we also think of them as active routes and as recreation opportunities. And then we're keeping a close eye on the work, the pay-for-performance bonds that we've seen both in the forest sector as well as in the stormwater management sector, mainly on the East Coast, and just thinking about how those funding mechanisms can be brought to bear as we think about scaling up and implementing this regional open space plan. And I show this photo clearly not up in a pristine watershed, but the important work of the Alliance is the connectivity of the entire watershed. And the health of Puget Sound depends a lot on the health of the entire watershed. And for most people that don't know this facility as a stormwater management facility, this is a major urban park amenity. And so this is another example of innovation in funding and partnering and networking and collaboration. It takes a parks department, it takes public works, it takes the capital budgeting folks, it takes the stormwater management folks, and many other communities interested in the benefits that this facility can provide. And this is the kind of opportunity that we're also keeping our eyes on to manage stormwater, which is also inextricably linked to the health of Puget Sound. And again, making that case for that no one organization, not PSRC, not our county government, not our state government, or any of the federal agencies that are active in investing here can achieve this work on its own. We need all these sectors, cross-sector, cross-geography, cross-discipline efforts working together so that we can really scale up our conservation and protection efforts across the region and improve the collective impact of every organization. So this is sort of the vision, again, of the Emerald Alliance and the role that we imagine ourselves playing. And I will leave it there and fast forward to our last slide and turn it back over to Jeff to moderate a discussion.
Well, super. Thank you very much, Tracy and Erica and Maria, for your presentation. We are going to move into a Q&A. We've got, I think, a couple questions right now, but if people have questions about the presentation, please submit them into the chat box, and we will try to address those. I also want to remind people we are interested in feedback on different conservation finance ideas that we might offer. Tracy covered a number of them. I think the slide that she had showing King County's efforts to look at their various funding sources was really, really helpful. And the fact that they're going to try to do that for some of the other counties is I think that's a great exercise. And so for those of you who are thinking about funding sources and have other ideas, we'd be happy to get your ideas, get your feedback on that. These are things that we could explore, or Emerald Alliance could explore over the next year or so remaining in their grant. So let's go to the questions. You know, it's funny, this first question I thought was really great because I had a question about this too, the drinking water sources and the areas that were identified. So this is a question back to probably Erica and Maria about the construction of the plan. And I'm curious about how drinking water sources were mapped consistently across the region, but there's a specific question that we've got that asks, what does the limited selection of drinking water source areas as an aquatic resource? It appears primarily limited to Chester Morse and Tolt reservoirs. Many smaller cities in the region have their own drinking water sources with unprotected watersheds and wellhead protection areas that warrant additional attention and would benefit from open space designations. So I think the question is really about how you incorporated drinking water source areas into the plan.
Yeah, and this is Maria. I can answer that question. I think part of that question is based off of this map. I'm pulling it now of the study area that maps municipal watersheds. So these watersheds that are mapped here, the municipal ones in blue, are ones the water utilities own already or have a conservation easement on. So the big blue one is the Chester Morse one that's mentioned that supplies a lot of the drinking water to the city of Seattle. This is not the other map I'll show is the Regional Open Space Network. The areas that support drinking water source areas are broader than the first map I showed. So the data that went into this is, I believe we got it from the Washington Department of Health, which has data for the locations of the smaller all the cities, all of the drinking drinking water source areas in the region. They're not visible, partially because some of them are small enough that they're just not, you just can't see them at this scale. And then also because the aquatic systems on this map are a lower layer. The working forests and natural lands and farmland are on top of aquatic systems, because if I had aquatic systems on top of the others, there'd be a lot more blue. It would be almost all blue, and you wouldn't be able to see where the working forests and farmland and natural lands are. So they're covered up, but they are actually there underneath, and you can see in the bubble network, the bubbles on the right, that there is that overlap, and a lot of that is coming from that data set on drinking water source areas. So we agree that those areas are important to call attention to, because a lot of them are unprotected, and they're important drinking water sources for some of our smaller cities. And so they are included as part of the aquatic systems. They're just not as visible on this map.
And this might be a good point, too, where we share some of the data with our partners who want to zero in on that type of open space, and we could share that data so that you can actually see exactly what's on that aquatic systems layer.
Yeah.
We're happy to do that.
So I guess, go ahead.
This is Tracy. I'll just add, and maybe it relates a little bit to the follow-up question here on will Vision 2050 address additional demand on drinking water resources, and the sort of the idea that among our 1.8 million more people, many of them are going to be climate refugees from other parts of the country that are struggling more than it's imagined we're going to struggle here in the Pacific Northwest. And I just want to say part of the work that I'm endeavoring through the Emerald Alliance is to work with partners in the U.S. Forest Service, the Partnership Office in Region 6 here, as well as Headquarters Office and Conservation Finance, to make connections with our regional utilities, certainly Seattle Public Utilities and Tacoma Water, to talk about this and how can the health and management of those upstream watersheds, particularly those that are source water for residents in the lower lying areas, how can we manage those lands and that sort of ethic of shared stewardship so that we can address that issue of what are the impacts to both the freshwater system as well as the underground aquifer system that we draw on in central Puget Sound, and how can we, as our snowpack diminishes and we're relying more on surface water and aquifers, how do we plan for that in this Vision 2050, and how can we engage our water utility network in those conversations? So I know that working with the Forest Service, bringing PSRC into those conversations, and connecting it to the regional work that's in the regional conversation on climate and climate management and climate adaptation that's happening also across the central Puget Sound region.
Great. Well, so we've talked about drinking water, and these drinking water supplies have to be available to the growing population of people moving into the area as well, and it sounds like this regional open space network tries to take that into account. Another question that we had was related to the FEMA program that you mentioned, the idea of protecting escape routes in the area using FEMA dollars to support a trail network. Do any of you know which FEMA program is the funding source for such regional trails?
Yeah, we were just talking about that across us. We've had conversations, and we've invited folks from FEMA to talk about that, and none of us are remembering right now which specific program. It's certainly in the on the disaster mitigation side. I just don't remember if it's planning or if it's response. Good question. Something we can find out.
Right, and they also, when we talked to FEMA, they emphasized the importance of green infrastructure and how you could put that into your cost-benefit calculation for your FEMA funding, and that was a rather new program at the time. So that was also something I think that's relevant to this group, is looking at the benefits of green infrastructure, which would include some of this work, and hopefully making the case to fund some of these projects. And then I wanted to go back to the earlier question about water supply. So it's a good one. The question was about, how are we addressing demand for the future for drinking water? And we do have here in the region a consortium of water suppliers that all work together, and we had a discussion with them when we started our Vision 2050 work, and we're going to continue those discussions. We identified coordination with our water suppliers as very important, both at the regional scale but also at the jurisdictional scale. So I think there's more work to be done, but we certainly are talking with them and coordinating with them. So I think that's a very good issue to keep track of with this regional plan.
And just as a follow-up on that, Erica, do you have any sense right now of are these collection of water suppliers providing any funding themselves toward watershed protection efforts? And if so, do you have a sense of the magnitude of funding that might be coming from them to support the kind of land conservation objectives that you have?
Yeah, I'll just start it. I know that they do their, for the ones that own their watersheds, they of course, are pouring a lot of funding into their own work to protect their watersheds, and I believe they're working together. But I don't know about, if there's a kind of a bigger watershed funding project there.
And this is Tracy. This is one of the areas that there's a lot of interest here in working with our national forests, Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in particular, but also the Olympic, out on the Olympic Peninsula, and bringing the Forest Service together with those water providers so that conversation those partnerships can develop. That's the sort of beginning place for imagining what kind of funding mechanism could be employed. And one of the other, certainly drinking water is one of the big issues as we think about our growth going forward. But as we're experiencing the changing climate here, on the west side of the Cascades, for the first time, there's a lot of talk about the risk of catastrophic fire. And it's not the same approach to managing forested landscapes on the west side of the Cascades as it is on the east side of the Cascades. And so we're beginning those conversations now, as the last 2 summers we've experienced more fires than anybody can ever imagine and remember on the west side of the western slopes of the Cascades, and smoke and ash all over the city of Seattle has really spurred folks to have these conversations. So both on source water protection and of course the catastrophic fire risk related to source water protection, and how are those conversations happening. And we're on the western slopes, we're just beginning those conversations.
Mm-hmm. So the comments about the Forest Service, I think, are important. They make me, and about FEMA, they make me think about different federal sources that may be available to help support watershed protection. And I'm just curious about whether or not that was incorporated into what King County did, where they were doing their calculations. It sounded like maybe it was in part, but do you see that there's another set of resources from federal sources that may be available to support watershed protection that could augment what the counties may ultimately contribute to the effort?
Yeah, I would imagine so. Again, we're so new into this realm of, into this discussion about catastrophic fire on the western slopes. And this pie chart was probably, I don't know, it's more than about 5 to 6 years old now. And so this was created prior to. But if you look at the different funding sources here, a number of them can be used to manage watershed protection in the upper reaches. And so that Salmon Recovery Funding Board, that $80 million there, the surfboard in the sort of lower right-hand quadrant, that's a significant portion that goes into managing upper watershed projects, as well as habitat restoration on the shoreline. And culvert, it's the investment in the upper watersheds, in the repair and replacement of culverts is also another funding source that we're looking at to contribute to watershed protection.
Great. Well, we just got, I guess we still have a little bit of time. If people have additional questions, you're welcome to submit them. But I just I've got a couple little questions that I thought might be helpful for people thinking about an effort like this. You mentioned, I think it was Erica mentioned as a next step, monitoring of some of this work. And I'm just curious if you could get a little more granular about how that might happen. It's a big plan. It covers a lot of different jurisdictions. Who's going to be responsible for monitoring this effort, and what does that look like? Is that a role that your agency, PSRC, is going to be able to play on a recurring basis to keep track of this?
Certainly when we update the plan, we'll want to see, how we did from the earlier plan. So if we update it every 5 years, then we'll have a snapshot of our progress, and that will be a very comprehensive look at all the different types of open space and all the partners that are here in the region. If we haven't decided yet if we want to do something kind of monitoring in between those major plan updates. We are looking into a monitoring program generally at PSRC that's a little bit more robust than what we have now. So there might be some open space measures that we kind of monitor on like a yearly basis or even more. But we haven't figured that out yet. So I would say we'll have a good snapshot probably every 5 years at least, if not more often. So we can look at lands that have been put into long-term protection through conservation easements. We have some fairly good data sources for a lot of these things. We can refresh our ownership layers and see what has been put into public ownership. We work with Puget Sound Partnership, and they do a lot of monitoring on a variety of measures, including floodplain restoration and stream restoration. So we can use their data as well. So we are trying to make sure that we plug into that collective impact effort. So those are a few sources that we can look at, but I think we're also still figuring out our monitoring program.
And this is Tracy. I would just add to that, saying that one of the gaps that we saw across the conservation community was there wasn't any regional capacity to track all of the county level, watershed level, parcel level investments that are happening across the region. And therefore, without that ability to see it all on a map and keep track of it over time, we don't have the assurance that we need that we're actually making progress toward the goals of recovering Puget Sound, as well as protecting specific resources on the landscape that we know we need to protect. So that's a role for the Emerald Alliance to play, working really closely with PSRC. There are capacities that we need to figure out how to mobilize and create that capacity within PSRC over the long run. And so it's one of the roles that the Alliance is imagining. Where would a funding stream come from to build that capacity within PSRC where it currently doesn't exist? And we need it to exist somewhere. We need it to be a regional scale effort that allows us to identify specific goals related to that pie chart or that watershed by watershed conservation need, and how are we doing on that whether it's 5 years, 2.5 years, figuring out what that time frame should be. That's an area of great interest to the constituents supporting the Emerald Alliance.
I'd also say that the data comprehensive plans and capital facilities planning is another opportunity to make sure that we're all going in the right direction. There's already a lot of good planning that goes on throughout the region, but as we see, where our plan can line up better with our local jurisdictions plan, we can have a conversation and hopefully get those into the capital facilities plan, even if it means that we need to help them look for extra funding so they can actually pay for that regional stormwater facility or new open space in a neighborhood that's a little bit needs more protection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Jeff, well, I'll just add that you're talking about in a kind of what we're really talking about here is an integrated planning effort, and how just yesterday I was at a floodplains by design workshop, which is a Nature Conservancy supported effort to look at integrated floodplain management across the state. And there's been dedicated funding from the state legislature to do that work. And it's just an interesting approach to do more integrated floodplain management. Well, how do the efforts of this open space plan connect with integrated floodplain management? So it's, again, building those relationships and creating those opportunities to partner across those different, more integrated, larger scale efforts that happen, more sector by sector, and how can we start looking at that together across a region, regardless of the sector.
Mm-hmm. Those are good comments, good thoughts. And I guess my last question to all of you as speakers is there may be other people on the call here today or others who will be listening to this webinar once it's recorded who may be thinking about large-scale conservation, watershed protection efforts like this. This is a really big plan, and it's got a long time frame. You've got 86 different jurisdictions, and I can only imagine that people change jobs and get elected and unelected and so forth and so on. So what's your advice for how to deal with the turnover that's going to happen within your communities there and to keep things moving, keep things together and moving forward? Is there any suggestions you have about the process that people should utilize to make that happen?
That's a good question, because that is always an issue with the turnover. I think keeping this plan in front of our boards and committees. Our boards and committees are made up of staff and elected officials from each jurisdiction. So if we are providing monitoring and telling them how we're doing, I think there's going to be continued interest. And as we update it, that kind of keeps it going. 5 years actually is a pretty short time period when you look at it. But I think continue to work with our partners. We have lots of nonprofits who focus on all of these areas. So I think we can kind of keep each other accountable too. This is really bringing in the public sector into work that there's high interest to a lot of nonprofits. So I think that's one great thing about it is it's kind of bringing a lot of different partners together who can remind each other of the importance of this work.
And the capacity for greater scale and pace, the more we collaborate and share resources and align our funding sources. And Jeff, I'll just add one more comment to that.
Okay.
I think that the plan is an interesting educational tool to take, we've taken it on the road, and so to speak, and we've gone out to the counties, and we will go back out to the counties. And as I work to build this sort of funding inventory across the rest of the counties, it's an opportunity to hone the message about the importance of watershed protection and to work to create those messages that resonate with the decision makers and constituents so that we can continue to put the pressure on and make the case for why this is a good investment and why it yields such a strong return on investment. And so we're eager to continue to use this plan, and as it's refined and as we build out this funding inventory for the other 3 counties, we will be continuing to hammer on that message.
I'm reminded of the comments Erica made at the outset here that having that support from those county executives in the 4 main counties was really important. Having that information at your fingertips on what the economic value of protecting these lands was also really key. And so it sounds to me like, yes, engaging with these communities and continuing to be front and center with them about this is a really important thing to do. So we appreciate your efforts out there, and thank you again for the presentation and the work that you're doing. I think that's the time that we've got right now. So with that, again, thanks everybody for being on the webinar, for sticking it out to the end. And if you have additional questions for Erica, Maria, or Tracy about their work, their contact information is up there on the screen, and you can learn more about the actual plan that they put together at the link down below as well, or the Emerald Alliance. So thanks again, everybody. And if any of your colleagues are interested in this as well, we will post the recording of this webinar in the next day or so, and you'll be able to download that or share the link with others as well. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.